Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our last Fearless conversation of this semester. Before we get started, what we've been doing in our previous Fearless conversations is allowing Dr. Craig Welfel to kind of give us our charge and help everyone understand why we have been engaging in these conversations. So Dr. Welfel is a professor of American, post-colonial, and British literature, I like saying it that way, here at Flagler College. So Dr. Welfel, will you please let our audience know who we are and why we're here?
Thanks, Dr. Miles. And welcome everyone, to another installment of our Fearless Conversation series. Flagler is taking these up as a campus in partnership with our community because our core values compel us to find ways to transform these difficult issues that threaten to divide us into opportunities to build understanding and to model productive and inclusive dialogue across differences. And it sounds a little bit dramatic, although perhaps not after recent weeks, but at risk if we do not, is nothing more than our existence as a community itself. The issues we face, like our differences, are not new. Indeed, they're often so old that it should appall us. But there's a new urgency to take them up and simultaneously a lack of faith in our capacity to grapple with them together. And if we lose that capacity to talk with one another, we don't just lose the dialogue between us, we lose us. We lose our community altogether. So here we are, and we've got difficult work to do. To paraphrase Mr. Rogers, we must talk about the difficult things because these things are part of being human. And when these parts of the human experience become mentionable, they become manageable. The question, of course, is how to make them manageable. And one way forward is reflected in the obligations that frame these conversations, which are also the bedrock of democratic and civic engagement. Among these obligations is not that we must agree with each other at the end, or that we should think the same things. Education is not to teach us what to think, but to give us the tools and the information to do the work of thought. And in that context, it's diversity of opinion that makes us stronger. So we want to represent a variety of viewpoints. And it turns out there's more than two sides to things. But we must also demand that the viewpoints are represented in a good faith manner, not talking points and straw men, but reasoned and evidence arguments, not simplifications, but diving into nuances and contexts and complexities. We must also seek expertise to guide us, to sift fact from opinion and truth from error. On the flip side, a conversation means we should listen and listen generously. We should seek to empathize and understand. And we should come ready to learn about the impacts of our ideas and our practices on people beyond our own personal experience. And keep in mind as you listen that we're here to discuss ideas, which are separate from who people are. People are complex. They're not defined by a single idea. And ideas, especially when they're difficult and personal, often come out wrong. More importantly, remember that people can change their minds. And that in fact, that is the goal, even if it's the hardest goal, of dialogue and critical thinking to begin with. And critical thinking is a bit of an education buzzword. And like a lot of buzzwords, it covers over a lot of BS and it can be sort of hard to define. But the best definition I've ever heard has all the cutting simplicity of truth. It's a question. When was the last time that you thought about or talked with someone about something that you really cared about and changed your mind? Not their mind, but yours. I think the answer to that for most of us is that it's probably been a long time. And that's a sad thing. It's perhaps the end of something more valuable than we might realize. It's the end of a kind of freedom. The freedom to choose what you think and believe is the essence of education. And tonight we're here to begin to think about these issues and questions surrounding the election from different points of view and about their connections and their consequences for all of us, so that we might have the freedom to choose what to do about it. That's not just an educational obligation, an ethical, and perhaps even a spiritual one as well. So let that define our community and begin our work tonight. And this is, of course, only a beginning, not a final conversation, but a conversation here that we hope starts many more out there. So welcome to Fearless Conversations. Dr. Miles, take it away.
Thank you so much. So I am going to introduce our topic as well as give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. So the 2020 election was and continues to be one of the most divisive in recent American history. But is it historically unprecedented? Have prior presidential elections resulted in contested outcomes, and how were they resolved? How did our electorate become so divided? What are the long and short-term consequences of 2020 on the presidency? And what issues does the election raise that captures the attention of experts within the fields of history and political science? Today, our panelists will share facts and insights into the 2020 presidential election and its place within American history and the potential impact on our democracy moving forward. So I will give each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves. First, Dr. Michael Butler, our Kenan Distinguished Professor of History. Can you share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel. This is my 12th year at Flagler College. My area of specialty is 20th century American Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the civil rights movement. And I believe that the courses that I teach have really helped inform the way that I and hopefully my students have viewed the changes and continuities that this election cycle has represented. So in our conversations today, I'm going to be drawing upon a lot of the prior studies that I've done to maybe give some insight and perspective into this really divisive period.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Rachel Cremona, Associate Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. I'm a political scientist at Flagler College. I've been at Flagler for 16 years. As you can probably tell from my accent, I am British, or I was. I'm American now. My areas of speciality are American government and, in a comparative perspective, also European government. So I've been very interested in watching a lot of the similarities unfolding politically in Western Europe and the United States over the last few years. And hopefully I can provide some insight into some of the continuities and also some of the differences that we're really seeing in this election.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Ms. Patricia Cheney, Senior Honors Student and Political Science major.
Hi, I'm a political science and international studies student. This was my first election that I was able to vote in. So leading up to this, I was able to take classes with most of the people on this panel and learn a little bit from their perspectives and what they've learned. So hopefully I'll be learning along with this discussion.
Fantastic. And our final panelist, Mr. Kevin Sweeney, Founder and Chief Strategist for Long Run Strategies, Political Campaign Operative and St. Augustine Beach resident.
Good evening, Dr. Miles. Thanks for having me. Kevin Sweeney, born and raised in St. Augustine, so I'm actually a townie. I've moved away many times and ended up coming back. I've moved as close as Gainesville, where I attended the University of Florida, and moved as far away as New Mexico. Between here and there, I've been involved in campaigns everywhere from city commission to governorships, both out in New Mexico and here in the state of Florida and a couple other places in between. Certainly, I'm very happy to be here tonight to kind of talk to you about, what we saw really in this election and in elections past. I got my start in election and campaigning back in 1976. My parents got me involved way back then in some local campaigns. And I even way back then went door to door polling on my own back in 1976 for a presidential race. So it's good to be here tonight. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you all for being here. So fun fact, I actually got my bachelor's degree in political science and have been just really invested in all things politics since I was really little. So I am excited to be here as a moderator, but really also as a fan of what I believe will come of this conversation. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to do a little housekeeping. We will have some time at the end of the conversation for questions from our attendees. So if you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A box, not the chat feature, because we don't have someone continuously monitoring the chat, but we will be monitoring the Q&A box. So now that I have that out of the way, I'm going to pose my first question, and I want to start with Dr. Butler. The 2020 election is one of the most divisive in recent American history, but is it historically unprecedented? Have prior presidential elections resulted in contested outcomes? And if so, how have they been resolved?
Yes, great question. Thank you, Dr. Miles. There have been contested elections in American history. It's really interesting too, because the Constitution gives us no one clear pathway concerning what the outcome of those contested elections will be. We have a contested election in 1800 with Thomas Jefferson and Burr. It goes to the House because it was an electoral tie. It took 37 votes in the House of Representatives to decide who the winner would be. And interestingly enough, one of the people who swung his support to Jefferson was Alexander Hamilton, everyone's favorite Disney Plus go-to these days, right? So we have the election of 1800, we have the election of 1824, where Andrew Jackson wins, stop me if you've heard this before, a majority of the popular vote, but because you had 4 candidates in a quote unquote corrupt bargain where John Quincy Adams wins the presidency and the person who swings in his favor, Henry Clay, is given the Secretary of State job, which at the time was the vice presidential pathway to the presidency of its day. The election that most interests me, 1876. 1876, we have Samuel J. Tilden, we have Rutherford B. Hayes, and we have the issue of voter intimidation, voter suppression, and racially motivated violence that divided the South when you had Southern Democrats once again given basically carte blanche to do what they wanted to do to enfranchised Black male voters. And it leads to 3 Southern states that actually submit 2 sets of election returns. Contrary to popular belief, we did not have a president until 3 days before Inauguration Day. And that's when a 15-person committee, again, not constitutional, experimental, decided that Rutherford B. Hayes would be given the presidency. And of course, the latest contested election was 2000, and the Supreme Court determined the Bush-Gore vote count stoppage. So it's not unprecedented. What is unprecedented is the unwillingness of the candidate who loses to concede defeat. That's something that is unprecedented. But it's not unprecedented that we have disputed results with 4 very different resolutions that transpire.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to share their perspective? Maybe not, of course, we just got a history lesson and these are all facts, but your perspective in terms of living through this or comparing this to other contested, the 2020 outcome to other contested elections?
I would add to what Dr. Butler was just saying. In terms of the failure to concede, I think is interesting. If you looked at the 1960 election, which was one of the closest elections in the 20th century, and JFK wins that election by less than 100,000 votes nationally, which is basically like 0.2%. And again, there was a lot of accusations, right? Some people believe they were well-founded about the Kennedy campaign getting support, particularly in Chicago and in South Texas. And those 2 states were key to him ultimately winning the election. And a lot of the more conservative media at the time cried foul. But interestingly enough, Nixon conceded fairly swiftly and gave the election to Kennedy. And I think the 2000 election too is very telling in this respect because, you know, in terms of Florida, it was 537 votes that divided those 2 candidates. And I love to tell my students, you know, we always talk about in the very kind of rational choice economic sense that voting is a waste of time, right? Because what's the chance that your 1 vote could change the outcome? And I think Florida, that 2000 election in Florida opened people's eyes that, you know, in a country of 300 million, we came down to 537 votes in Florida. But again, there were 60,000 votes in Florida in that election, where we had the controversy of the butterfly ballot, 60,000 votes that did not register a choice for the president, right? That's unprecedented. Who goes to vote and doesn't make a choice for the president? But again, right, it ultimately plays out through the court system. But you didn't have, it was a much more kind of a legalistic battle in that election, as opposed to a, you know, I'm just not going to concede, or this is fraudulent. So I think it is interesting that this is definitely not unprecedented, but the way that it's playing out in many respects is.
Any other thoughts before I move on?
You know, I just, you know, to go to Rachel's point once again, you know, I think we have seen this throughout our nation's history. You know, there certainly is a schism within the electorate when we vote for president. You know, we see, you know, even dating back to when President Tyler tried to run for re-election, you know, I think we saw people burning him in effigy on the White House lawn. You know, we saw there was such a schism in the United States that when he passed, Abraham Lincoln refused to move the flags to half mast. There was no official mourning of the passing of the president. So certainly we've been we've had the schism within our electorate for a long time, and we'll see it again and again and again. Dr. Butler certainly mentioned many. There are many others that we could talk about. 1968 certainly was one of them. I think it was 1896 with McKinley, you know, battling a populace there. You know, certainly we see this time and time again. Really in 2016, you know, we saw the same type of schism within our electorate. There are still people who I think believe that, you know, the Russians came in and stole the election for Donald Trump and took it away from Hillary Clinton. And, you know, those divisions, you know, manifested once again here in the 2020 election. And I'm sure we'll see it again in 2022 and 20 and 24. But as was mentioned, what we've never seen really before is what we might call the unpeaceful displacement of power from one presidency to the next, you know, waiting for Donald Trump to finally, you know, give in, admit defeat, and peacefully transfer the power to Joe Biden is something we haven't seen certainly in a long time.
I would like to throw in one more observation, Dr. Miles, at the risk of dropping another history lesson. There is one point of comparison that I think is bothersome, and that's the election of 1860. Because in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran as a Republican. The Republican Party was the party of abolition. And South Carolina openly said, if he wins, we're out. The failure to accept the outcome of a democratic election is the precipitating point of secession. We have some ominous overtones here, or undertones or overtones, I guess, where we have one group saying, we will not accept any result except the one that favors this guy. And the historical chill that runs down my spine is when someone makes Richard Nixon look gracious, you know there's problems.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching a clip, well, a number of clips, and there was, back in 2016, Donald Trump said, I will accept the outcome of the election if I win. So he is who he said he was, right? That is, and he is not wavered. But the unfortunate thing is, I believe he knows the weight of his words. But the unfortunate thing is the difference between 2016 and now is that he has a following that feels a lot more empowered to act on his whims in a way that I don't know was the same in 2016.
But certainly, I think in 2000 and in 2016, there were still theories that Gore could win, that Clinton could win, based on the faithless elector theory in the Electoral College. And, you know, that continued to move. Now, were there lawsuits, perhaps in the Bush-Gore 2000 race? We saw lawsuits like we see today, and someone can certainly correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember this amount of lawsuits by the Clinton campaign in 2016. There was certainly a hope that there might be faithless electors in the December of that year's election in the Electoral College, which never, of course, panned out. But certainly on this level, we've certainly never seen it. But certainly there's been a smaller push towards where we are now in the last 20, 26 years.
And certainly if there were lawsuits, and I know with Bush-Gore, of course, that made the Supreme Court, but we have never seen the degree of one-sidedness. Dr. Cremona, are we now 0 for 28 in Trump lawsuits?
Yeah, pretty much. And
That's the last count that I saw.
The latest one is the interesting one I thought that I heard most recently today, which was trying to challenge the way in which the states choose their electors for the Electoral College, right? So if we could move that to the legislature of the state, right? And many of these states that he needed have Republican legislatures. If they can choose the electors, we can somehow change the outcome. So it's kind of after the fact, we're going to change the system to give me the victory, which I find extremely troubling and, really is unprecedented, particularly in modern America.
And certainly, I think it's too important to point out that in 2016, you look at who the attorneys were for President-elect Bush at the time. I believe 3 of those attorneys who were practicing in the state of Florida on the recount here in the state of Florida currently sit on the Supreme Court. And I think if you look now, perhaps some of the brain power in the Trump legal team, I can't imagine we'll see them on the Supreme Court anytime too soon. Perhaps that's possible. But there's certainly, I think, a stark difference between what we saw in 2000 and in 2020 today.
All right, so I am going to shift to our next question. And Dr. Cremona, I'd like to start with you. So from your perspective, how did we find ourselves here as a country? How do we get to the point where, there seems to be a clear winner of the popular vote, but even with a clear winner of the popular vote, we have 70 million Americans who disagree. So how did our electorate become so divided?
I think it's a real great question on everyone's lips. I think some of this, I think both Mike and Kevin have touched on this. The division of the American electorate is not new. And I think if you went back to the very beginning, the founding of the United States, you'd find this kind of division between those that more resembled, I guess, the founding fathers and the Enlightenment ideology of kind of rationality and science and the rule of law. And then those who really saw America in terms of culture and tradition and spirituality. So I think that division is at the very root of the country. I think what's changed, and I always found it interesting when that election in 2000 happened and the Electoral College decided the presidency, and all of a sudden everyone was up in arms. How does this even happen? But as I'm sure Dr. Butler could tell us, it hadn't happened in that way since the period of Reconstruction, since the post-Civil War era. And that is very telling, because when the country then was divided in the aftermath of a literal civil war. So, and then that doesn't happen again until the year 2000. And there are a couple of things from the political science perspective. One is what some people call the big sort, which really began in the late 1970s. And that has a lot to do with where Americans are moving to. And the tendency at the very local level, if you look at the level of kind of counties and districts, that they're becoming increasingly less competitive. Americans, if they have the choice, will move to an area that they see is populated by like-minded people. So if I'm a liberal, I want to move to, a big city or a liberal area, and same for conservatives. And I think that's illustrated in this election. I think out of 435 seats in the House, only 41 of them were considered to be competitive elections.
Wow.
That's incredibly telling. So there is that element of it. I think the media plays an enormous role in this, and social media, because the other thing that pushes you, right, you'll always have people historically that identified as Republican or Democrat. What's noticeable is that it's getting more to the extreme of conservative and liberal on both sides. And a part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that we are all now only checking into the kind of media that we want to see. We couldn't do that 30 years ago. We were all watching the same evening news on the same generic channels. So we were all getting the same message. Now, you know, if I'm a conservative, I'm only listening to Fox News, right? And if I'm a liberal, I'm only watching MSNBC. And so we're getting vastly different versions of the news. And then you add social media to that, and algorithms and artificial intelligence. And now Facebook is making that even more prominent. So it's clicked that I'm a conservative, and now it's just flooding my feed with conservative news. And, you know, there's been a lot of research on that in the field of communications that shows if you only surround yourself with like-minded people, even if you start out as a moderate Democrat and you only surround yourself with Democrats, you're going to end up way further to the left, and the same on the right. So I think it's a massive combination of things that are going on. But I'd say that the media plays a big role in how it's playing out today.
So Patricia, I want to ask you, since this is the first election that you have been able to participate in, how does this feel for you to see this divide?
I actually spoke about this a little bit earlier. During all of the election, it's like heartbreaking, I think, to most of us who've grown up in a very like calm electorate, right? Like growing up, there was never riots, right? Like leading up to the election, my social media was just filled with videos and images of people boarding up the capital of our country and all of our major cities in fear of rioting, which is not something that I ever imagined being the result of my first election. But at the same time, like so many incredible things have happened in this election. Voter turnout for young people my age was the highest it's ever been. 52 to 55% of first-time voters turned out, which it's never been that high. And I think that that's because of how polarized we've become, which is both good and bad. It's terrifying that it took something so intense as the 2016 to 2020, the 4 years of President Trump's presidency, to cause this big of a turnout. But it's also heartwarming to see so many people involved in politics, and most of them caring so much about what happens in their own state and in their country.
I agree. It's definitely a situation where it's you see the good and the bad, and you try to figure out where it all shakes out. Kevin, were you about to speak?
Yeah, you know, I think certainly to go to Dr. Simona's point, our social media has weaponized many people. I have friends and family who certainly were involved in the political process, were aware, but I think through social media, through just getting your information through MSNBC or Fox News, we've become weaponized. And certainly that's part of the Enlightenment versus the counter-Enlightenment schisms we see within the country. And I think drilling down on that, it weakens our political parties. So our political parties have become weaker because of that. And that means you have to then appeal to the fringe voters. So you've got fringe voters on both the Democrat and Republican side. And again, to a point made earlier, primaries become important because the general elections are no longer competitive. So if you want to win a seat in Congress, if you want to win a seat in the state house or the state senate, you really have to appeal to the fringes in your primary, because in your primary, if you are a Republican or a Democrat, you are probably going to make it to the general election, and you will easily win the election in November if you can win that primary. So we've got our parties are now controlled by the fringes. Whether if you're on the Enlightenment side, it's controlled by what some call the woke culture. If you are on the counter Enlightenment side, it's the white supremacist fringe that's going on, and that's what people have to appeal to win their primaries. So when they go on and win and they go into the general, that is what we're going to see. There is money to be made in making people angry and making people scared. And that's what these weak political parties have done. And that kind of puts us where we are, that we are having to border up our big cities, during election and after election, because people have become so weaponized. I was having a discussion with Steve Shale, who worked on the Biden campaign over a year ago. And he was telling me even back then, pay attention to South Carolina. Don't look at Iowa, which is a caucus, because again, you've got extremes who are going to come out, brave the snow and the cold weather to go out and stand in a gymnasium at 32 below zero with 7 or 8 people, and they are going to vote for the person they want. It's not going to really show what the entire population of Iowa wants. Then you'd move on to New Hampshire, which has a very small population. It's easy to talk to them. So that really doesn't play well in a Democratic primary. His belief was wait for South Carolina. That's when you'll see Joe Biden appeal to the moderate wing of the Democratic Party and win that primary and go on to win the nomination. And that's what we saw play out. So there is a way for moderates in both parties to certainly win their way into the general, but they have to take a beating earlier, just like Joe Biden did when he won the nomination.
Yeah, I was talking to some friends and we all said, I don't know a single person who at the beginning of the Democratic field, when there was like 1,000 people in it, said, Joe Biden is my guy. But by the end of it, that is exactly what everyone, as you said, more moderate Democrats were saying.
And I think if you look back, real quick, if you look back 5 or 6 years ago, if we had stronger parties, truthfully, the Republicans probably would have nominated Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush would have been the nominee on the Republican side. It would not have been Donald Trump. But again, we have weak political parties that are having to play to the extremes, and that's how Trumpism starts.
We have weak political parties who place the party and their identification as a member of the party above country and constitution. It's really interesting that we have so many people determining what the Constitution means when most of them haven't read it themselves. I tend to look at this as a long-term phenomenon, even though history teaches us that we learn nothing from history.
Well,
we have
Go ahead.
I'm pretty cynical or realistic that way, because we can blame social media, but then explain to me 1968 in Chicago. Explain to me the whole world is watching. Explain to me what's going on in Vietnam. There's always something that radicalizes the fringe elements of any group. It could be a generational gap. It could be a conflict over war. Hell, it could be a conflict over music, right? But there's always something that alienates two divergent groups. This trend that culminated in Donald Trump did not start 4 years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. This started in 1968, if not before, when whites began to leave the Democratic Party because they became the party of civil rights. With 1968, you have George Wallace running as an independent. You have Richard Nixon using a Southern strategy that built on the failed platform of George Wallace. And you had almost 80% of Florida in 1968 that went for either Wallace or Nixon in the general election. Keep going. 1980, you've got Ronald Reagan. The moral majority buys in. Reaganomics. Welfare queens. The war on drugs. The demonization of our minority groups. Keep going. Then you have a war on terror. You have brown people who are discriminated against. And then we have a brown president. And there's going to be a backlash. History demonstrates that anytime we have racial progress as a nation, there will be, if not one step back, 3 or 4 giant leaps back. The fact that we had 8 years of President Obama, opposed by a Congress, by the way, of Republicans who made it their career ambition to prevent him from doing anything while in office. And we had Hillary Clinton, a strong, confident, prepared, competent woman running for the presidency, meant that our two historical forces of racism and sexism culminated in the figure of a man who said, I don't represent all Americans, I represent my supporters. That's unprecedented, and that's a peak, not necessarily a valley. We have trended in the direction of Donald Trump. He's not an aberration.
No,
Actually, oh, go ahead.
sorry, no, and I would really add to that. I mean, I think you witness it, you know, the presidency of Barack Obama, you witnessed the rise of the Tea Party, which, you know, might have begun as a kind of libertarian anti-tax group, but very quickly, by account of all the research done on it, turned into an incredibly racist extremist group that triumphed in those midterms in 2010. And it was built up frustration that, you know, really came out of the closet, so to speak, in 2016 in the election of Trump. So, you know, I really agree with Dr. Butler on that. I think, and the one thing I would really add too, especially when I compare this to much of the populism that you see in Europe, the historical distrust in government in the United States that is so, so very deeply rooted, much more so than you'd see in any other democracy, is absolute fertile ground for conspiracy theories, for fake news, for, you know, the popularity of QAnon amongst the right wing. These are things that are, you know, if I think about it from my European perspective, that they're kind of crazy. And I know even in Europe, where I know a lot of people that are far more conservative and right wing, even they're looking on thinking, well, really, that people actually believe that, that their government is, you know, in some ways, it's almost shocking to think you can truly believe that your government is completely taken over by what pedophiles and this deep state idea. But it does play in, there is a cultural aspect to that, I think, in the sense that, you know, historically, the country was built on distrust of government and distrust of tyranny and fear. And, you know, that makes them much more fertile ground for this kind of really extremism that we've seen more recently.
Well, honestly, I feel like this conversation is a great segue to the next question. And anyone who wants to start, feel free. I'd like to hear from all of the panelists. What do you think are going to be the long and short-term consequences of this 2020 election on the presidency itself? And what issues do you think the election raises that, you know, captures your interest as an expert in this field?
I can start if you like. I mean, I think from the political science perspective, obviously in the short term, as far as the electorate, you've got the consequences of violence and confrontation that Patricia mentioned earlier, which I think has got everybody on edge right now. I think you've also got the phenomena of extremism going further to the extreme because they didn't win the election. And that's obviously being fueled, right, by a president who is contributing to the stories of fraud and the election being stolen, despite there being absolutely no evidence. I think as far as the government, the more worrying thing is the transfer of power. And there's been quite a lot of talk about this, particularly in the security and intelligence communities, that Trump's failure to concede is making it very difficult for them to prepare Biden to take over that role as commander in chief. Some people even mentioned, you know, during that 2000 election, because it took so long, it took us into December before that election was really settled. There was a very short turnover, a transition period between President Clinton and President Bush. And some people say that added to our not being prepared for 9/11. So there is that in the short term, that fear that, you know, you're not just, this isn't just rhetoric and hot air and things that will blow off. You may be permanently creating damage that could come back to haunt us in the near future. And then I think in the long term, the obvious one that's had a lot of attention is the undermining of democracy. I've seen in previous elections, especially since 2000, a lot of kind of talk about corruption in the electoral process, and in many cases, evidence of very clear corruption at the local level. And it's always been kind of pushed to the side. And I think the reason for that is it's fine to lose an election and be upset about it and think, okay, well, in 4 years, I get to try again. That's what keeps democracy stable. Because there's always losers. Half of us or so are always losing. If I lose and then you tell me I lost because the system isn't fair, because the system cheated me, then I have no investment in the system and I have no reason to believe it to be legitimate. You seriously threaten the fabric of the democracy at that point. That is a potential long-term consequence of this that I don't think that we can ignore at this point.
If I could just go back to the last questions real quick, I think it's important to add, certainly there have been conspiracy theories on the left as well. You know, it's easy to point to QAnon because that's the big thing in the news. It's the big thing on social media. But certainly I think you can go back to conspiracy theories that said that President Bush allowed 9/11 to happen so he could take all the oil in the Middle East. You know, certainly we have seen those conspiracy theories happen for a long time. I'm sure they went back to, you know, George Washington and how he was chosen to be our first president. But looking forward, you know, I think one of the most important things that we can take away from this past election is how people vote. You know, I'm excited that we've got, you know, people finally using vote by mail. You know, it's something that we've seen out in the West for a long time now in Colorado and Oregon and Washington. And obviously now, because of COVID-19, certainly played a part in it. But we see that people are able to, you know, take advantage of voting by mail. You now have almost a month of voting. It's no longer election day, it's election month. And, you know, I think that's something exciting to look at as we move forward, to kind of go back and look at how we can just make our election system better and stronger. That's what I'm most excited about moving forward, looking at the 2020 election.
Oh man, but if you pair that with what Dr. Cremona brought up about undermining the process, and we have one party that's significantly trying to undermine the vote by mail process and the mail-in ballot process, that's a recipe for potential collapse as well.
Sure, but again, if you look at the history of vote by mail, and certainly they've been doing it out in Oregon and Washington now for 20 years. And it was first opposed by Democrats because Democrats made the same exact argument Dr. Cremona made, that you can undermine and easily manipulate those vote by mail ballots that come in. We've seen that not to be true. So, you know, again, it's just a matter of educating the electorate, which is, I think they've done a great job in Colorado, again, in Washington and Oregon, to use vote by mail as a means to make elections easier for more people and for more people to, you know, be enfranchised to vote. And, you know, I think certainly, do we have issues now? Yes. But for years, it was Democrats in the state of Florida who, you know, had a problem with the way that Republicans were able to maneuver and get their absentee ballots at the time in. And really, truthfully, if you look at the history of the state of Florida, at least when Republicans took control, it was because Republicans were able to go out and chase absentee ballots better than Democrats. And that's how they eventually took control of the state government, because of the way they were able to grab those absentee ballots. So, you know, we've seen that change now. Certainly in this past 2020 election, Democrats have caught up and are doing a much better job than they have before. And suddenly, at least in the state of Florida, Democrats love the idea of vote by mail.
The Republicans are chasing ballots, but they're also disenfranchising large groups of people that they don't think are necessarily worthy of the vote too. So there's a shifting nature of the party system as well. To Dr. Miles' question, I would like to say, you know, the things that are different, I think the genie's out of the bottle. And what I mean by that is that we have someone who held the executive who is historically unique because he said, I don't represent all Americans. I represent my supporters and my supporters only. That is historically unprecedented. Not only that, but we have someone who downplays expertise, who calls his most educated advisors idiots, who uses the bully pulpit as an unfettered bully. And it worked. 72 million people wanted 4 more years of it. The genie's out of the bottle because what this president has made abundantly clear is that the presidential norms, the norms of the office, the traditions of the office, that all people, regardless of political affiliation, have agreed are important for the fabric of our democracy, he's basically shrugged his shoulders and said, and? When it comes to tax returns, and? When it comes to annulments, and? When it comes to bleep hole countries, when it comes to all of the norms that he has basically asked, where's it written down that we can't do this? Okay, we're not doing that. That is historically unprecedented, and that gives me concern for not now, but 2024 and 2028 and my children and the democracy of the country that they'll inherit.
But Dr. Butler, certainly we saw the same thing in 1968. We saw, you know, again, we had law and order.
Yeah.
People, if you go back and look as a student of history, we saw the same civil unrest, you know, certainly in the streets of Chicago during the Democratic Party nomination. Years after that, you know, Richard Nixon, the foundation of our democracy was strong enough to survive that. Certainly people thought it was the end of the world. It wasn't. I think the foundations of our democracy are strong enough to move beyond this. Is it going to take a while? Sure. Some people are still fighting Watergate. Some people are still fighting 2020. I know people personally who still believe that Al Gore should have been the president of the United States. And they will always believe that. And they have not gotten over that. There are people who believe that Hillary Clinton should have been president of the United States, that the Russians stole that election for Donald Trump. I think again and again, it's not always pretty. Democracy certainly isn't pretty. But I still think our foundations are strong enough to see us through. And eventually, you know, the adults will step up and we will have a peaceful transition of power to President-elect Biden. If you look back on our history, that's what it shows. Again and again and again, even when our country was divided, when Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on some of the ballots in the South, I think you mentioned that earlier, somehow we survived, our country survived, and I'm going to guess it was probably, well, I think that the foundations of our democracy is strong.
Go ahead.
Just quickly, I see what you're saying, Kevin, but to build on what Dr. Butler said, yes, it's not that this is the first time that this country has been divided. It's not the first time that we've seen violence or that people have disagreed over election outcomes. It is the first time you have had a president that has changed the institutional nature of the presidency. That, I think, is a very important point. The way that we perceive the president has changed. It began changing in the 60s with Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and Iran-Contra in the 80s. We don't have anywhere near as much respect for the presidency as we did pre-JFK. However, seeing a president act in the way that you've seen President Trump act in terms of the way he uses Twitter, in terms of the way he does things that really demean the office of the presidency, that make us feel, and his supporters themselves will say it. We like him because he says it as it is, because he's not afraid to make fun of disabled people or to be sexist towards women or to support white nationalism. He's not politically correct. He doesn't do any of those things. He doesn't act like an intellectual. He acts like one of us. Fine, if that's what you want the office of the presidency to look like for the most powerful country in the world and arguably the most powerful person in the world, that's what's changed. And I think it's impossible to say, even Nixon and Watergate, Nixon still demonstrated the persona of the presidency. He lied and he cheated, and I'm not saying other presidents haven't done the same. What you haven't had is a president get up there and literally, I'm going to declare that this is all fraudulent. He lies. I mean, how, and again, all politicians lie, let's be honest. But he lies so blatantly that he doesn't even try to cover that he's lying or to kind of return from the fact that he's lied. And then he's caught out and he'll lie again. So those things, I think, are very different. Are we ever going to see the presidency in the same way? Is it important for us as a democracy to have a level of respect for the office of the presidency, a level of respect that I think isn't there anymore?
To Kevin's point, and I'm going to use his own, I want to use Kevin's own analogy against him a little bit here, and I'm not trying to be shady about it, but you said that the party, the fringe elements have taken over. The reason that Nixon resigned was because the Republican Party turned against him. The party is enabling Donald Trump. You've got Lindsey Graham and your Mitch McConnells, who are supposedly, we were told 4 years ago, they're going to be the adults in the room, because if you remember, Lindsey Graham was the one who said Donald Trump will destroy the Republican Party and we will have deserved it. They're the ones now that are enabling him. Nixon didn't have any enablers left. They had all turned on him. So he had to resign. You can't shame the shameless. And I think that's why the genie's out of the bottle.
Sure, I think, but again, let's go back to President Clinton, who lied under oath. He also had enablers that made him stay strong, stay in the White House when he lied under oath before Congress because he did not have sexual relations with that woman. You know, I think eventually, again, the adults will, like they did with Nixon, no longer allow the president to act the way he is. Now, when that time comes, is different for each party, each man and each woman. But I will just say, the difference with Trump is, for whatever reason, he is very open about what he does and what he believes. I think John F. Kennedy is one of the most beloved presidents in our nation's history for many reasons, most of them good. Let's face it, what we now know about President Kennedy, it's probably best we didn't find out about it when he was president, because it was not good. And if there was a Twitter of the day, and he was going on and on about the people he was running in and out of the White House again and again every day, perhaps who knows where we would be. I just think when you have Donald Trump, you have somebody who's open and for good or bad, honest about what he believes and what he says. And that is what kind of difference is here. And we've allowed our country to be ruled by a stronger and stronger executive branch. That's, really, if you look at it, it's becoming stronger and stronger every 4 years. And Donald Trump has just been in the right place at the right time, I guess, to allow this genie to come out of the bottle once and for all. And I will say again for the 1,000th time, I think the foundations of our democracy are strong enough to get us through.
So I'll add that this is just a Sandra Miles opinion. I worry about the thought process that the foundations of our democracy are strong enough, because the foundations of our democracy are the people. And it's the people who make these choices. It's the people who get us to these places. And I think some of what happened, and this is again just my opinion, I think some of what happened in 2016 were people voted in a way that suggested they didn't think it was possible to break the government. They didn't think it mattered who was the cabinet, because the system would just work itself out. And we've seen that the people actually do matter. I would also add that, making some of these comparisons can be dangerous sometimes, because like people who can't get over Al Gore and Clinton's losses are because those two actually won the popular vote. It's not exactly the same thing as being unable to get over someone who lost the popular vote in the Electoral College. But I think this is a great place to transition, because now I want to ask each of you one last question. What do you think moving forward for our presidential transition? What is your prediction for how this transition of power over the next few months, how do you think it will pan out? And what suggestions, or what do you suggest to change our system so that we can move our democracy forward?
I can actually, this makes me really nervous because I think that a lot of Democrats are relieved that Biden has won, and there's just a mass sigh of relief, which is great, but also a failure to keep our new president in check, right? Like people are, I think, excited that the Democrat won and have no interest now in seeing what he's going to do and just trusting that because we've elected a Democratic president, things will start to calm down. But that's not the case at all, right? Like if we are looking at Biden's past, which President Trump did point out a lot in some of these debates, he has not been on the side of what he's preaching right now, and neither has Kamala Harris, right? Like they both support private prisons, and these are things that need to be addressed immediately. And I'm really afraid that because we're sighing in relief, we'll just continue to be ignorant to what's going on in the next 4 years.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, the Democrats went with Biden because Biden is your moderate Democrat, and he could pull back the working class, and it worked. He's a neoliberal. He's a Hillary Clinton in that sense. The Democrats are not going to address the economic issues, the failures of capitalism that have brought the Western world, right? One of the things we haven't mentioned in this discussion is the underlying economic issues that are leading to a lot of these problems, right? That you know, some might argue, let's push identity politics, whether it's on the side of white supremacy or on the side of kind of identity policing, so that we distract everyone from the loss of the middle class in the United States, right? From the aggressive foreign policy of the United States abroad in the name of capitalism, and definitely not in the name of democracy. And Biden is more of the same, right? And what's ironic is those people on the left that hated that about Hillary Clinton got 4 years of Donald Trump, and they're jumping into Biden's arms and kissing him all over. And it's like, thank God we're back to business as usual. But business as usual didn't work. And if the Democrats do not recognize that, and if they don't start to change the way that party works and the way that it reaches out to its constituents, then the Trump phenomena is not going to go away. It's going to keep coming back. So I think there's a lot of self-reflection that needs to happen, but it also needs to happen for the Republicans. Because as Mike, quoted Lindsey Graham, I think Trump has destroyed the Republican Party in many respects. And none of us should want to see that happen, because we need a healthy two-party system in this country, and we don't have one right now. We need a really good choice for reasonable, thoughtful citizens to make, instead of blind partisanship. In this election, I guarantee you, everyone was going into those ballot booths, red, 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 and blue, 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 not even bothering to look. And we don't need that. That's not healthy. So I think there needs to be a lot of self-reflection on the part of both political parties in terms of why you have a country that is so incredibly disaffected and dissatisfied. And what are you going to do about that? When are we going to get back to talking about the real issues again, about the environment, about poverty, about healthcare, all of these things that are actually incredibly pressing issues. And to be honest, we need the Democrats to step up. I know Biden has said his goal is to unify the country, and that he's not simply going to represent the people that voted for him in the same way that Trump did that. And I believe him. I believe, that he will try to do that. But, the Democrats need to figure out, how to reorganize themselves so they aren't alienating large portions of their constituency.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll sorry, Dr. Butler, please.
No, go ahead. I've talked enough. I'll go on.
I can't remember if it was Dr. Miles or Dr. Butler who said, you know, the persona of the presidency has changed, and certainly being worried about that. In November, the people spoke and they rejected Donald Trump's view of the persona of the presidency. So again, that's why I think, you know, perhaps we're moving in safer hands. You know, the problem I think we have is that if you look at really the breakdown, you know, Biden did not win the working blue class. That's not what brought him where we are today. It was smaller coalitions of other groups that really made him the president-elect. And that's what the Democratic Party needs to start to focus on, because I think in many ways they have dropped the ball. They have believed that African-American voters, Hispanic voters were just going to naturally vote for them. And we have seen that that is simply not true. You know, that's where the game is going to be played in Florida and in the South as the Democrats try to build a coalition with those groups in the North. If they're going to hold the Northeast like they have, and the new pickups in Arizona and Nevada, that's where the Democrats have to go. Republicans certainly have to look at where they want to lead the country. I think we are in good hands. You talked about climate change. You know, we've got a Speaker of the House, incoming Speaker of the House, Chris Sprowls, who on multiple occasions has talked about climate change, how it's important that Republicans and Democrats alike, he is a Republican, start to address climate change and rising tides in our state. And that's important. And we've seen the speaker designate after him, Danny Perez from Miami, talk about climate change. So certainly I think there are Republicans and Democrats who see some common ground and we can work together. That's truly where we have to go. We have to start working together again, because certainly we don't want to continue on this path where, you know, it's 50-50, or we're going to be having the same conversation with the same group that we have assembled here tonight in 4 years if people don't start to recognize the Enlightenment and the counter-Enlightenment groups that we have in our country, and realize that it's okay if you are a believer in ethnicity and culture to talk to someone who believes in science and reason. That's where we've got to go. That is what will save us. If we continue down this road where I only believe in science, I'm only going to talk to people who believe in science. If you believe what you believe because you come from Scotland or because you read the Bible, that's how you're going to go, then we are never going to get anywhere good as a nation. And I think that's where the two parties really have to start moving towards.
Politics is the art of compromise, and we've lost that art. And I think it's because of the
Some people have.
I think most people have, because you keep saying that democracy held only by a few million votes, only by a few million votes.
But Dr.
And the
Butler,
the working class that you said didn't vote for Biden, the white working class didn't vote for Biden. The minority working class did. What I would say
the Hispanic working class did not, Dr. Butler. The Hispanic working class did not.
So we have to distinguish between Hispanic as well, because the Cuban working class, the Mexican working class, I think that's another thing that this election has demonstrated, is that we can't really speak in monoliths. It's hard to do it now. It's harder and harder to do that. But I do think the art of compromise is lost in the contemporary political climate. We can talk reason and we can talk enlightenment all we want. But if there is a side that rejects the humanity of those who believe in enlightenment and facts, there's not going to be a conversation. It's, again, not being pessimistic, trying to be realistic, but it's just unprecedented. And the fact that we have Georgia with 2 Senate seats up is going to determine what happens during the Biden presidency. And you think the presidential contest was vitriolic, it's going to get just as bad in Georgia after the squatter is finally removed.
But Dr. Butler, you continue to, you seem to dismiss that there were 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump. By the words you just spoke, you are just, saying that they are wrong and are trying to dismiss them. And that's okay if you disagree, but it breaks with your fundamental point that we should be working in conjunction with those people.
When I try to have political conversations with people and they thoroughly dismiss it and say you're part of the problem, there is no basis for conversation.
But you are saying
all we want.
But you are saying right now that they are part of the problem, and certainly if
it's both sides.
It is both sides. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to jump in and referee right there. I appreciate the dialogue because this is 1,000% appropriate for the topic of conversation. And it shows that, these topics are not just, you can't just use facts and figures. These are emotional topics. These are topics that determine our future. And I think people should be invested enough to be able to disagree agreeably. We have our eternal optimist, Kevin Sweeney, and that's what I've gotten from some of your comments. And then, of course, our eternal pessimist, Dr. Butler, who has provided quite a bit of not just personal reflection, but interspersed with the actual facts and history of what's going on. And I honestly think this conversation has been truly amazing. And we do now want to turn, we have 2 questions in our chat. And so the first question actually was addressed to Patricia. So I will go ahead and ask you, do you think the way this election is playing out, that the people who voted for the first time, like yourself, may be discouraged in future elections?
Oh, wow. I don't know if they'd be discouraged, but I think we will continue to vote. I think we will continue to see high voter turnout. But I'm afraid that the goal of that turnout will be a little bit different than I think in the past. Like Dr. Cremona was saying, whenever a candidate that you were hoping to win loses, in the past, it's just been, okay, well, it's 4 years, it's not going to be too big of a difference between the 2 candidates. But we've seen kind of a massive polarization and shift in that way. And so I'm really nervous to see what the next candidates will look like, and how Biden approaches the 2 different political sides, because he's preaching like some unity right now, which is fantastic. But whether or not the population actually coincides with that is going to be a totally different story. The election is incredibly close, like much closer than I think most of us were predicting it would be. And those political views aren't just going to disappear because Biden was elected as president. And I think the reactions of those and what we see in our hometowns, especially with police, is going to have a large role in the way that the election is going to turn out in another 4 years, and how my generation will continue to vote and regard elections as to whether or not they really are democratic and equal.
Thank you. So our second question is more of a number of comments, and I'm going to use a few of them and then ask a question. So we have an attendee who has perceived this conversation to be very biased and hateful towards President Trump. And so there is a perception that some of the comments that Biden has been elected are inappropriate because there has been no winner declared. And there's also a comment in here that states that the Supreme Court will decide the race, not the media. So I will create a question out of that to ask, do you believe that this election will be decided by the Supreme Court? Or do you believe that there has already been a winner that has emerged?
I'll start. A winner has been announced, basically. He has over 300 electoral college votes. I don't think there's any doubt that he won the election at this point. And as of this point, other than accusations, there hasn't been any evidence that we should believe he hasn't won. All of the lawsuits right, so far, not one, there hasn't been one that has been entertained. So I don't think that that's unfair or biased, to say quite honestly. As far as the Supreme Court deciding, I know this is what a lot of people, and particularly Trump supporters, are holding on to, because that's what happened in 2000. And as we saw, that was a court that was 5 Republican nominated judges and 4 Democratic, and it went for Bush. But what I don't think people realize is the court was ruling on a very specific issue in that case. It wasn't who should be president. It was, should Florida have the right to recount again? Because there was such a close margin of victory. As far as all of the court cases we are seeing right now, they're all being dealt with at the state level, which is entirely appropriate because elections are under the guise of state power. Which obviously Republicans should appreciate since they tend to be the party of states' rights as opposed to federal government intervention. So the likelihood that it will go to the Supreme Court, I would argue, is very, very small. And I think equally the court itself under John Roberts, despite the fact that it is dominated by Republicans, would be incredibly reluctant to set a precedent of intervening in this election. An election where Biden has 5 million more, roughly, popular vote. He clearly has the Electoral College. I think the Supreme Court relies upon its prestige and its respect from the public. It took a hit in 2000 when it decided that case for Florida. If it were to try to decide this case at the national level, I think it would take a massive hit. So no, I don't think it will go to the Supreme Court. And yes, I do think that we know who won the election at this point.
I'm all out of tinfoil hats. I think that Joe Biden is our president-elect. I believe that he will be inaugurated as our president on January 20th. And Dr. Butler, I'm glad you're here because all my friends and family think I'm the pessimist all the time. So,
you know, Mr. Sweeney, I was going to suggest after the panel closed, but I'll just do it here in a public forum. I think I need you as my therapist because you have really talked me off of the ledge on a few things, and I really appreciate that. You're right. There's not one side that monopolizes the ridiculousness. It does come from both sides. Yeah. But the people that mostly converse with me about history, when they deny the historical facts, that tends to be where the conversation goes. So you're absolutely right about that, and I will state that. I tend to look at the scoreboard. My son's a soccer player, and if he was getting beat 28-0, which is the score of the federal lawsuits right now on the behalf of the Trump administration, I'd say, dude, you might want to try a new sport. I think it's over. 28-0. And if you look at some of the comments that federal judges have made about the frivolousness of those suits, it's pretty clear cut, it seems to me as well.
All right, Patricia, I'll give you a chance to give us any last words before we end this.
I mean, like, I completely agree, right? Like, I think that we know where the next president's going, but I'm just overly, I'm hopeful, right? Like, we've had such an incredible turnout, and I think so many people are excited to learn and see where we can go from here. And if we can look at it from that side, then I think everything will start to get a little bit better, and we can get a better faith back in our democracy.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of our speakers and the audience for their participation today. Our Fearless Conversation series is going to take a break next month, but we'll be back in January. So stay up to date on the schedule for Fearless Conversations. You can do so by going to our website at flagler.edu/fearlessconversations. So I want to wish all of you a wonderful, healthy, socially distant, masked up holiday season, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Great job, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I enjoyed that. That was fun. And I'm serious, Kevin. I might get your number from Beth and give you a call when I'm feeling most despondent in the future, because we all need balance every now and then.
just a reminder, everybody, we're still live, so I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting for everybody. So thank you all for participating. It was a really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Y'all have a great holiday.
Bye
You
now.
too.